Welcome to the Wellness Law Podcast, where wellness and the law meet for contemplation and collaboration. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Health and Wellness Law. I am your host, Barbara Zabawa. Welcome, Pamela Miles, to the Wellness Law Podcast. Everyone, I'm so thrilled that Pamela Miles is here with me as a guest. She is an internationally renowned Reiki master and the foremost medical Reiki pioneer, bringing Reiki practice to conventional medicine in the 1990s. She has been featured in mainstream media, including The Dr. Oz Show, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, The Atlantic, Forbes, U.S. News, World Report, New York Magazine, Allure, and Self. She's the author of the award-winning Reiki, A Comprehensive Guide, the only Reiki book written for the mainstream public and healthcare professionals. So she is quite a titan, and I'm so honored that she's here on the Wellness Law Podcast. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm as excited about the work you do as you seem to be about the work I do. So thank you for that.
Yeah, so let's start with your background. I just read off a little bit of your bio, but tell us how you got into Reiki.
Well, I'd been in a spiritual community since I was a kid. I started meditating and learning yoga practice from books when I was a tween. And then many years later, I was a meditation teacher and a professional healer, working with people in what would probably now be called mind body medicine,
Huh?
helping people access their self healing, to optimize their self healing, to manage their mindset. And then I became a mom. And then I was pregnant with my second child, and I was concerned, how would I be able to continue my daily spiritual practice with two young children? And I'd heard about Reiki practice, but never through a credible link, through signs on telephone posts in New York City where I live. But then a friend of mine, a very credible gal, told me she had just taken the class, and she offered me a session, and the rest is history. I learned to practice as soon as I could. And because I was already in this line of work, I was able to start introducing Reiki practice to my clients very early on, and they loved the results they were seeing and enjoyed the experience.
That is just a great background and a story of how you came to learn and practice in this space of Reiki. So now continue to practice, correct?
Yes, I practice on myself every day. That's the morning before I open my eyes. I'm already practicing self Reiki. And I also teach people to practice Reiki on themselves. I teach professionals, and I work one on one with clients.
I'll make sure to put a link to your website in the description for this podcast so people can find you. But I understand now, in addition to practicing, you also do some advocacy work on behalf of other Reiki practitioners. Could you talk a little bit about that, and specifically what you know about some states trying to regulate Reiki and other complementary alternative medical professions?
I will try to keep it brief. Decades ago, the first attempt that I heard of was in Texas. It actually came from a Reiki master who had a client who was a state legislator, and she had the idea that all Reiki professionals should be licensed and approved by her. And when I found out about that, I just started making noise. And this was before email and such, where we were writing letters. And fortunately, we were able to expose what was happening, and that was dropped. There has been another attempt from within the Reiki community. There have been states like Vermont actually did require that you submit your name and what you do to the state. Oregon has had an attempt. Massachusetts has now had their seventh attempt in the legislature to require licensing, not just for Reiki, but for a whole list for all what's referred to as complementary and alternative medicine modalities. And then there have been other attempts like in Maryland at one point where, as I recall, it was the chiropractic and the acupuncturist who were trying to get some kind of licensing passed. They were already licensed and they wanted more control, and the language in the bill could have been used to disenfranchise Reiki practitioners or anybody who's working, who would be understood legally to be working in the subtle vibrational fields or the
Mhm.
biofield. And
So we're saying that the chiropractors and the acupuncturists were trying to fold in Reiki practice into their scope of practice.
there was no mention of Reiki practice or other things, but the language was so broad that we were concerned that it could have been interpreted after the fact and
As
disenfranchised a number of other professions, including Reiki professionals. So we made a lot of noise. I have a wide network and I reached out to people, and by then we did have email. And once the legislator who had introduced, there were two of them in each house, uh, once they understood the ramifications, I think it might have been quite innocent, but once they understood that there were broader ramifications, the bills were dropped within 24 hours.
let's talk about some of those ramifications that you had to explain to the legislators, because I find it interesting that people within the Reiki profession would want to have a licensure statute. So, can you talk a little bit about some of the ramifications that resonated with the legislators that had them ultimately drop some of these initiatives?
I think what resonated with them had nothing to do with Reiki practice and everything to do with they felt that they were being manipulated by what amounted to a lobbying group. And they're there, they do what they do to protect their constituents, not to gather power for any particular profession. So
Yeah.
go back to the idea of that licensing is to protect the public against professionals who maybe are not skilled in methods that could be harmful in
Mhm.
their attempt to help. They can be harmful, like surgery, for example. Everybody wants surgeons to be licensed, but with Reiki practice, there is no such concern. In fact, the National Institutes of Health, the NCCIH, on their website, they state clearly that there is no evidence of harm regarding Reiki practice. So, if there's no evidence of harm in all the years that Reiki practice has been unregulated, why would the legislature seek to regulate something that is a practice of such an ineffable nature? Reiki practice is somewhat like meditation.
Mhm.
It really is a spiritual practice rather than a healthcare modality.
Yes. So, just to close the loop on why someone within the Reiki industry would want to have a licensure statute, are you saying that the individuals you're aware of who have pushed for licensure of Reiki would have more self-interest in mind than anything else?
Yes, it was a power grab, plain and simple. They wanted to make a lot of money and control the industry. And occasionally, someone who's not really informed yet, sophisticated in these matters, a Reiki professional will say, I think licensing is a good idea because it will increase the credibility. And it's that they haven't understood the ramifications.
Yes.
And they don't realize that licensing It is not to increase credibility. That's our job as professionals, to improve our credibility.
It's more of a business strategy than anything.
Yes, and the public then can choose if somebody likes a more sophisticated approach or they like a more down home approach. This is up to what feels comfortable to the individual, and the public needs to have the ability to choose to work with professionals that they resonate with, because that's where they're going to have the best outcomes.
Yes. And that couldn't be more true than with wellness professions like Reiki and others, where you'd mentioned optimizing self healing is really the goal, the purpose of a lot of these practices. And that's very personal. As you mentioned, for Reiki's, it's a spiritual matter. And to try to regulate that doesn't seem to me, as a lawyer who practices in this area, as quite the justification for regulating practices that where the ultimate goal is to optimize your self-healing, to engage in self-actualization, to optimize your spirituality or tap into your spirituality. That just doesn't seem like a proper use of regulatory authority by the government.
I think we're of one mind in that area.
Yeah, because that and I'm trying to craft or articulate a framework to help state legislators or federal regulators or judges in the case of if there's a lawsuit involving a wellness practitioner. Why is it necessary for a licensing board to go after a an unlicensed wellness practitioner when the typical person coming to see those practitioners is to engage in this optimization of their self-healing capability, to tap into their spiritual being? And that's not why people go to the medical professions where there is licensure, where there is regulation. I find your description of Reiki very helpful. And I guess I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about um, the people that you've seen come into Reiki practice, from a client standpoint. Like, who are they? Do they fit that mold?
I would say that there are people who want to help themselves. Yes, I agree with that. And that may be the only thing that they all have in common, because in my experience, they come from all kinds of backgrounds, from every socioeconomic level. I've worked with people in the hospital programs. I created the first in hospital Reiki program where I was training people with HIV, AIDS to practice on themselves and to practice informally with one another. It's like home health care. At home health care, like when people talk about how your first medicine is in your kitchen, not in your bathroom. So this is along the same lines, and I've also worked with people who live in penthouses on Park Avenue. And because there's a point at which we all have to deal with being alone in our lives, no matter how many people are around us, and to see if we can find a place of peace and empowerment there.
Yeah.
It's good not to wait until you're dying to check that out.
Yeah. And so that's where I think wellness really does provide a place for people to explore that and to find that peace that you're talking about. And I think another important point to reiterate that you had said is that the NIH has not seen any, or has said that there's been no evidence of harm from Reiki practices, possibly other wellness practices, but we are focusing on Reiki right now. And that, I think, is an important point, because if the state's going to regulate something, it should be tied to some potential harm. Otherwise, what's the point?
an intervention that has the potential, if it's not used properly, or sometimes even when it is used properly, to create harm, definitely needs to be regulated. But our attempts to be the best human beings we can be, to find that inner peace and happiness and strengthen the resilience in our systems overall, that's really a spiritual pursuit, whether people recognize it as such or not. And how can we possibly regulate that? To say nothing of the reality that there are a myriad approaches to Reiki practice now. So, would the state government then decide this is how you have to practice Reiki? And who would decide that? People who don't even practice Reiki.
Yeah.
It's really, I think, a fool's mission here. They're not thinking how they could possibly implement this.
Yeah. Yes, and I am so glad that you mentioned that people who think, right, getting a licensure statute for a practice, like a wellness type of practice, Reiki or otherwise, would bring credibility. I think you're right that they haven't really thought through the whole timeline and the implications, because along with licensure comes scrutiny, comes expenses, comes more regulation and headaches, frankly, and you lose that freedom, that flexibility, that which is, I think, imperative for a lot of these practices that are dealing with very personal ways to self-actualize, to optimize. It's not gonna be the same for everyone, and so there needs to be that flexibility that regulation kind of eliminates.
We need to be able to move freely and ethically, of course, within very subjective realms,
Yeah.
and to help people gain their self confidence that, yes, I can do that. I know what's good for me. I can choose, for example, the doctor that I prefer to work with, if you're lucky enough to have that option. That these subjective elements matter. People feel safe, then they heal better.
Yeah. If people wanna learn more about you and your work and your book, I assume your book, Reiki: A Comprehensive Guide, is on Amazon?
It is.
And your website, you have a few websites. Which one do you think people should go to learn most about your work?
Reiki in Medicine, Reiki in medicine.org is dedicated to Reiki practice and Reiki practice at home if you want to learn to practice on yourself and your family and friends informally, or if you already know how to practice and you want to deepen your practice, or you're a professional and you want continuing education. I address all of those needs, as well as having a Protect Reiki advocacy in which I collaborate with an organization called Reiki Unified, and their website is reikiunified.com. It's a really great place to stay on top of the legislative efforts that pop up from time to time.
Well, wonderful. I'll make sure those are linked in the description. And thank you so much, Pamela Miles, for being a guest on the Wellness Law podcast. I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the time that you spent today educating us about it.
And thank you, Barbara. I enjoyed our conversation very much, and I hope a lot of people benefit from it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Wellness Law Podcast. You can find more wellness law resources by visiting the Center for Health and Wellness Law website at www.wellnesslaw.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Until the next episode, stay well, stay hopeful, and stay legal.